Today comes from the Gospel of Matthew, and there we read, Jesus said, "You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It's no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city put on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Let us pray. O Lord, may your words only be spoken and your words only heard. We do ask this all for your love's precious sake. Amen. Please be seated. Well, in today's gospel, amongst other things, Jesus says that we are the light of the world. You are the light of the world, Jesus says. And we don't typically think of our Christian tradition as a tradition of enlightenment, and yet when Jesus says we are the light of the world, he's saying that we are, in fact, enlightened. But enlightenment in our tradition isn't something so much we pursue, it's something we are. You are the light of the world. You are enlightened. And it's not so much something we know, it's something we do. When we're enlightened, we let our light shine, and we do good works. Those good works are loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves, loving the people in our family, our spouse, our children, loving our friends, loving our neighbors, our co-workers, the people in the world. So for Jesus, enlightenment isn't something we seek or pursue, it's something we are. It's not expressed in the acquisition of knowledge, but it's expressed in the simple doing of what we know is right, doing good works, helping others, being kind to others, loving others. And so the question becomes, what keeps us from doing those good works? What keeps us from letting our light shine? What is it that takes light away from our lives? What is it that takes mind away, leaves us with less mind? And we could answer that with a great many things, but the thing I want to talk about today are what we're going to call hooks. And hooks are patterns of behavior, and most of these patterns of behavior we learned by the time we were 3. Virtually all of them we learned by the time we're 5. They were ways that we attempted to solve problems in our life that probably worked really well for us when we were kids. And then they slipped into the background. They just became part of the hardware of our mind. So they slipped into the background of our thought processes, so they went unconscious. And so we don't think of them anymore. And so when we apply those same processes that we learned as kids, but we're still using those as adults, and as adults they don't work, we don't realize that it's the process that's not working. We think it's a situation or a person or somebody or something else that's causing all these problems. It's not. It's this process we learned when we were very, very young that went unconscious, that we've never become conscious of. And it's that process that's shutting our light down, that's keeping us from being able to do the works that God calls us to do, to love other people like we want to love other people. It's that process that keeps us from being enlightened. And so this process, hooks, they typically occur in everyday situations, and the kind of situations that will initiate a hook can be things like a difficult conversation, maybe a difficult conversation at work, maybe a difficult conversation at home, might be a disappointing situation, again, might be at work, might be in the community, might be with one of our kids. It might be something as simple as traffic, like ordinary everyday traffic. But what it does is it evokes an autopilot response. That autopilot response might be sarcasm, might be withdrawal, might be pitching a fit, might be any one of a number of things. And then the response, so there's the situation, the automatic response, the autopilot, and then there's the result, and the result is going to be eminently predictable. In fact, it's going to be as predictable as this. If I say to you, this first phrase, you complete it how? Mary had a little lamb. Everybody says, everybody knows it. Mary had a little, that's the trigger that sort of hooks us in, and our brain is going to have the predictable response every time. Mary had a little lamb. So we have everyday situation, autopilot response, predictable result. Predictable result. And that's why in our lives, we have problems that have been in our lives as long as we can remember. In our marriages, in our parenting, in our work, in our national life, we have these problems that have been going on as long as we can remember, because we think the problems are out there with somebody else, but in fact the problems are in here. They're part of the hardwiring of our brains. The way we learn to solve things, the routines we develop, the emotional routines we developed when we were very young that served us really well, but as we get older don't serve us well at all. We're like wind-up toys. And we really are. We're literally like this. There are things that wind us up. The hooks, the triggers, the buttons, they wind us up. And then we just go on autopilot. A wind-up toy just keep bumping into the same wall, right? Just bump, bump, and never stops. The door might be right here, but it's so wound up, all it knows how to do is just keep bumping into that wall over and over and over again. So, let's take a little closer look at what makes for these hooks and how they get so deeply embedded in our minds and in our lives and then in the world. And again, part of the reason this is so important is these hooks, these triggers, they don't just create problems for us in our personal life. They do, for sure. They don't just create problems for us in our families. They do, and that obviously is a problem. But they get played out on a larger stage. So right now, for instance, they get played out on a national stage. And the playing out of these what end up being our own problems and end up in many ways being our own childishness on a national stage has brought us all to a precipitous point. So let's see if we can come up with a better understanding of how this happens. The first step in the process occurs through what is sometimes called our internal chatterbox, or the word that I like, our internal blabbermouth, or my own word that I just made up this morning at 8 o'clock, inadvertently, but I kind of like, our internal blabberbox. And that seems like a great word. You should probably use it today, and let's see if we can get it introduced into our internal blabberbox. And any given day, an average adult speaks about 16,000 words audibly. But internally, we speak a whole heck of a lot more. And that's the internal blabberbox. Never shuts up, always going on, always talking. And what it's doing is it's telling a story. It's all these different voices, but it brings these voices together to tell a story. As it turns out, we're all screenwriters. We're all writing a script, only our movie isn't playing on a movie screen in a local theater. It's playing in our brains and then ultimately in our lives. So all of us write stories. We're all story writers. We're all scripters. What we're writing is the story of our life. What we're scripting is the movie of our life. And what we do through and our internal blabberbox is the stuff from which we write the stories, the stuff from which we create our scripts. And these stories, these scripts, like a good movie, all resolve around conflicts. And that's what gets the blabberbox going, is our various conflicts. It might be a conflict with ourselves, might be a conflict with another person, might be a conflict at work, might be a conflict in the nation. But what we do is it's that conflict that winds us up, gets the blabberbox talking, and then from that we create these stories, we write these scripts that somehow let us be the good person, or at least let us live with ourselves. If we can't be a good person in the story, we're going to at least find a way to organize such things that we can live with ourselves. The problem is that this internal narrator is unreliable, and that these thoughts that we take as facts are subject to biases and prejudices. We learn our emotional routines, basically ages 1 to 3, pretty much set by the time we're 5, but we learn our biases and prejudices from ages about 4 to 8. That's when we learn our biases and prejudices. And we basically learn them from our family of origin, and we learn them from our community. And again, we learn them early on, we practice them early on, and then they go unconscious. They just become part of our mental hardwiring. And so when we get to be my age, you don't even think about them as biases and prejudices. They just seem like the way things are. They just seem like reality. They just seem like facts. But in fact, they're biases. So our internal narrator tells these stories as an unreliable narrator, and the story itself is subject to biases, prejudices, unrealities. And so because the story might allow me to be a good guy, best of case scenarios, or at least live with myself, The problem is, since the way of doing this is based on thoughts that aren't accurate, that don't really match up with the real world, it doesn't solve any of the real conflicts out in the real world, which is why the problems keep on happening. The inner chatterbox, the inner blabberbox, the inner blabbermouth. It lets us live with ourselves. It's exhausting, right? I mean, it's exhausting. It lets us live with ourselves. But because the thoughts that we're thinking on, because the premises it's built upon are too often inaccurate, biased, prejudiced, self-serving, the stories we tell simply are not true. They're fictions. And so they might solve the problem in here, but they don't solve the problem out there, and the problems continue. We can get a sense of this really easily just by saying a few words and then thinking about what comes to mind. So, for instance, I can say to a word like cell phone. And when I say cell phone, a bunch of thoughts will start coming into our head. And so maybe the first one would be something like, cell phone needs an update. Is that a fact? It might feel like a fact, but it's not a fact at all. It's an opinion. It's entirely subjective. I might say my cell phone is old. Is that a fact? No, obviously that's a judgment. I'm old. My cell phone's not. I mean, come on now. See, that's not a fact, but you see that's where the thoughts lead. All of a sudden, I'm not just thinking about my cell phone, and I'm thinking about me, and I'm thinking about how I feel old. And that's inaccurate, subjective, opinionated, so on and so forth. A word, my house. And you can just see where people go with this. You know, my house is a mess. My house is always a mess. Well, is your house always a mess? Probably not. Some people, I see their heads shaking yes, but no, probably not. I mean, your house probably isn't as much of a mess as you think it is, and it's probably actually pretty neat some of the time. But our brains create this story, and then we jump from that. My house is always a mess. I'm a failure, right? My cell phone needs an upgrade. My whole life needs an upgrade. I'm a failure. And we can sort of go on from there. So these stories that we tell, they start the hook. Now, if you know the thing about a hook, unless you're using barbless hooks because you want to let your fish go, but most hooks have a barb on them. And so the hook point comes around like this, and then there's a little piece of metal that sticks out going the other way, and if you drive the hook in deep enough, the barb gets set, and then it won't come back out. That's why, by the way, you don't want to hook yourself, because that's a real problem. I speak from experience. So what these other things do is they drive the hook in even deeper so that they get set even harder. So our mental hardware takes this story and then it's going to amplify it. It's going to add juice to it. It does this, first of all, through what's often called technicolor thought blending. All right? It's basically putting a technicolor dream coat on the stories, which makes everything more vivid. Makes everything seem more real, and so it takes it begins to call up memories, images, and some of these can be very, very visceral. So, for instance, last night somebody said, they said my cell phone, what they thought is needs a charge. My cell phone needs a charge, and then it's not just my cell phone needs a charge. There's so many things in my life that I wish I wanted to do that I haven't done that I really need to do, and then it's, gee, I've wanted to make my kids cookies for a long, long time. And then all of a sudden the memory comes back of my mother baking me cookies. And now the brain doesn't just bring the memory of how good it was sitting in the kitchen with mom baking cookies, but now it actually evokes smells of those cookies. And oh my goodness, and a person's mouth starts to rewater. And now it's this compelling story. I should be making cookies for my kids, but I don't. And I'm a terrible mom, and my kids resent me, and I'm blowing this whole parenting thing, and I hate my job because my job doesn't let me make cookies for my kids. And this is that technicolor thought blending. It's driving the hook, the response, much, much deeper. And then we add on to that the emotional punch. That's the third component, that emotional punch. Emotions, whether by evolutionary or divine design, have a great purpose in our lives. And what they do is they predispose us to action. They shut down our intellectual processes, which are quite slow, and then they actually trigger physiological responses that predispose us to very quick action. So, for instance, when we get sad, our body, through the release of certain chemicals, it actually slows us way down. It actually drops our energy level real low, because when you're sad, you don't think real well. And if you're not thinking real well and you try and do something, you or somebody else is going to get hurt. If a person, for instance, is going to fight a saber-toothed tiger, and if they're really sad and they're just not, and therefore their thought processes are slow, they're moving slow, then they're going to get hurt, and probably their whole hunting party is going to get hurt. So the emotion of being sad wants to slow us down, so we just don't feel well and we don't end up going on the hunting party. Because if we went on the hunting party, we'd be a liability to ourselves and everybody else. So sadness actually serves a great function, and there's a physiological response that predisposes us to a healthy way of being. It predisposes us to remembering things that are hurtful to us. Because things that go well, typically our survival doesn't depend on those things, but things that hurt us, see, in the old days, something might hurt you, it might kill you, so you got to remember the things that hurt you so they don't kill you the next time. That's why we remember all the bad stuff in our life, but not the good stuff, because our brains add chemicals that deepen our memories of the bad stuff so that we can avoid them. But what happens is we end up repeating them. And our brains, when we feel, say, anger or fear threatened, then our emotions predispose us to fight or flight. And again, we understand how this happens. We walk through the door out here. However many years ago saber-toothed tigers lived on the earth. There's a big saber-toothed tiger sitting out there. And I look at that and I say, is that a saber-toothed tiger? Or is that my neighbor's dog? And if it's my neighbor's dog and I hurt it, then my neighbor really likes a dog and they will probably come after me, and that's going to be a very unpleasant situation. But if, on the other hand, that is a saber-toothed tiger, I should probably, and about this time what happens? The saber-toothed tiger eats me, right? And I die. So emotions shut that process down, and by that fight or flight mechanism, it increases my pulse rate, it increases respirations, it floods our body with chemicals that make our muscles more predisposed to action. So now I see a saber-toothed tiger, without even thinking, I'm going to do one of two things. If I have a weapon, I'm going to fight, just instantaneously, boom, or I'm going to run, or I'm going to freeze and hope it doesn't see me. And once it served humanity really well when there were real threats. But in our day and age, what we perceive as threats most of the time aren't actual real life-threatening threats, right? Our spouse we perceive as a threat. Our kid we perceive as a threat. Our parents we perceive as a threat. Our coworker we perceive as a threat. People of a different perspective or viewpoint or political party we perceive as a threat. And most of the time, none of these things are threats like a saber-toothed tiger is a threat. And yet they evoke that same visceral response. We lay the emotion on top of that, and it evokes that same threat, that same response. And so just like we would attack, hit hard fast, when we feel threatened, that's exactly what we're going to do. Or freeze, or withdraw, or run away. It evokes that same response. And so we can get ordinary, everyday situations. I can see an older couple, and all of a sudden that just becomes a trigger in my mind where all of a sudden I think, oh no, I'm not sure my job's secure. And if my job isn't secure, do I really have enough money for retirement? And I don't think, and all of a sudden I'm just feeling tremendously bad about myself. Or I see a young couple together. And it makes me, this doesn't, I'm just spinning a tale. It makes me think of my young daughter who's in a relationship with a guy I don't even like. And I think, oh no, is this going to wreck my daughter's life? And then, I see them and I say something I don't want to say to my daughter, because now this relationship becomes a threat to me, and I respond in a way that isn't helpful to anybody, and the relationship gets broken. And that's how this whole hooking process happens, okay? Starts with an internal blabberbox. Is amplified. The hook is set deeper. Anybody interesting? I would be happy to talk to them. It's set deeper by technicolor thought blending, and then it is really punched the whole way in there by that emotional amplification. Now, again, it's really, really important that we learn to deal with these things, that we be, in essence, transformed. This is what we talked about last week. You need to be transformed. I need to be transformed. It's obvious some people need to be transformed, right? We look at the people that come to AA or NA and we say they got to be transformed. Their life depends on it. But the simple truth is, you need to be transformed. I need to be transformed just as much as the people who come to NA or AA, and your life depends on it, and your kids' life depends on it, and our country's life depends on it. It's not really clear that our country can continue the way that it's going right now, and things. So you need to be transformed. You really do. I need to be transformed. If we're serious about finding a better way ahead, then transformation is not an option. It's not just something for other people. A guy by the name of Thomas Keating at the DeWitt Lectures at Harvard, he said this, and I think this is absolutely brilliant. And this was like 10 years ago, so think how prescient this is. How we live together with different points of view is going to become more and more important. I don't know whether we can make progress in such a progress without a practice that alerts us to our own biases, prejudices, and self-centered programs for happiness, especially when they trample on other people's rights and perspectives. All right? And there's plenty of that going around right now, isn't there? 10 years ago, and yet how much that applies to today. And then he goes on to say, and this is a guy who's a depth psychologist, so most of his training is in depth psychology, but he also has a spiritual practice in his life, a practice of contemplative prayer. And he says, if we don't allow the Spirit of God, and listen to this, this is one of the most profound things I've ever read. If we don't allow the Spirit of God to address the deep levels of our attachments to ourselves and to our programs for happiness, the ones we established as kids but don't work as adults, we pour into the world the negative elements of our self-centeredness. We'll think it's something else, but it's our self-centeredness, adding to the conflicts and social disasters that come from over-identifying with the biases and prejudices of our particular culture and upbringing. I'm going to read that one more time because it's so good. If we don't allow the Spirit of God to address the deep levels of our attachments to ourselves and to our programs for happiness, we'll pour into the world the negative elements of our self-centeredness, adding to the conflicts and social disasters that come from over-identifying with the biases and prejudices of our particular culture and upbringing. We won't see them as such, but that is what they are. So what do we do about that? Well, we made a good start. We made a good start in becoming mindful of what's beneath the surface, of making the unconscious conscious, of realizing that our thoughts are not the same things as facts. Our thoughts don't have to end up in our behaviors and our actions. In between thoughts and actions, behaviors, is our ability to respond. You know, it's classic Viktor Frankl, man's search for meaning. In between stimulus and response is the human ability to respond. Just because I have a thought, it doesn't have to lead me here. I do have a choice. Now, how do we capitalize on that choice? Well, for that, you just have to come back next week. Amen? Amen.